Value Impulses, the podcast for potential development by and with Uli Vogel. A very warm welcome, dear listeners, to our episode today with the provocative title, Are We Beyond Saving? Values in Economy, Politics, and Society, Part 1. Part 1, here I'm dealing with domestic politics, so what's going on within our own country? Part 2 will then move on to the international level. So, we're dealing here with value impulses and with potential development. And I've already spoken a lot and had many interviews as well when it comes to the individual person, but today. And in the second episode, it's about the aggregate, how we do business together, how we live together, having a common statehood, so to speak, and how we also shape our lives together in society in terms of values. So the why of these two episodes is basically that values are central to our living together, no matter which direction it takes. We are simply our values. And recently I lay awake at night and was thinking about these topics, and I thought to myself, I should really go into this a bit more deeply here in my podcast. And for that, of course, my educational background is quite well suited. For those who don't know, I once studied political science along with economics and public law, and then did a PhD in international politics. And so I believe, with the work I've been doing for many years, with the values of individual people, but also from a value science perspective in combination with political science, I can perhaps contribute a thing or two, and I want to do it in a very down-to-earth way, very relaxed and not make it a big scientific production, although now and then the reference to science is not insignificant. I'd like to cite two works, which I'll also include in the show notes. One book by Paul Kennedy, called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, is a truly excellent and insightful work, one that I highly recommend. It's a book where you can really see how societies, even large societies, manage to achieve a rise, to generate influence, even power, of course prosperity, and everything that goes with it, to also achieve an excellent coexistence in terms of state, politics, and society. And how does it happen then that it also simply falls apart again? Sometimes over decades, centuries. Yeah, if we look at Rome, for example, ancient Rome, sometimes it happens faster, of course. And we should also take a self-critical look at Germany in this context. Right, if we look at the economic miracle, the 50s, 60s, and then the decades after that, still at a very high level and moving forward. And if we look back now at the last 2 decades, average productivity, in terms of productivity growth, has become extremely much lower, so to speak. And for the next decade, I think, a very low single-digit average productivity growth is expected. And if we, also look into society, we see to some extent, hey, that power of upward mobility isn't there anymore, but you get the feeling, somewhat, of a defensive struggle against decline. And yeah, I want to look behind that a bit, because I'm not here to engage in bashing, but I want to shed some light on the basic mechanisms behind it. And as is so often the case, it's the values that make the difference here. So Paul Kennedy is one literature recommendation, if you look at it internationally, and then also please. Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind. In my opinion, that's also a wonderful work to understand how we humans are actually wired. And for the largest part of our history, we were hunter-gatherers out there and lived together in hordes before agriculture, the revolution, and all the rest came along. So, compared to that, what has happened in the last 10,000 years is a blink of an eye, as Harari put it, history. Before that, for many, many, many millennia, we were just living differently. And that's how we're socially programmed as well. So, now I'd like to dive in here, and I've prepared a bit of a structure. For, the values in economy, politics, and society. Can we still be saved? Was the provocative title behind it. First off, yes, I believe we can be saved. And I've set up 10 so-called bipolar value axes. I really like working with bipolarity, with values that go in two directions, into the positive and also into the negative. Why do I do that? Because many people, when it comes to values, well, they're a bit overly positive and idealistic and say, yeah. And this is all something that's psychologically very important. And we need the good values and so on. Yes, that's all correct, too. Many people also say that values are just for website talk or well. That's just what we say here in Sunday speeches and so on. And cynical people say in the end, it's a funny saying, I think, that you can hang your values so high that you can easily walk right under them. And that's not the point, because values are much more fundamental. And it's not just about promoting good values, but also about pushing back against bad values. And you could also call them anti-values. And that's why I've set up 10 bipolar axes here, with the positive value on the left and the negative on the right, and I'll try to project that practically onto economy, politics, and society, which are my 3 levels here that I want to examine, and I'll start with a very central value. Or rather, a bipolar value axis: freedom versus oppression. I think that's something very fundamental. Of course, most of us grew up in freedom and still live in freedom today. And well, whether they can still appreciate it, because for them, for us, for our generations here, it's actually completely normal, well, it's worth challenging, yes. Let's look over at Russia, or let's look at North Korea. For decades, well, almost centuries, oppression there has been. It's so commonplace, so not having the choice today to say, I'm doing this right now, or I want to achieve that, or I want to do that, or I want to say, think, feel, publish, act, yes, break time equals 0.5s / all of these things. And yes, I really do believe that, as research has shown over many decades, including both recent studies and those from earlier years, freedom plays a crucial role in helping people realize their full potential. The evidence suggests that when individuals are given the freedom to make their own choices and to express themselves, they are much more likely to thrive and to bring out the best in themselves. So I would say, to an optimized output in society. So if we are able to guarantee freedom, then people can freely develop their talents accordingly. When they are oppressed, it's not that easy. But now maybe a quick note on all these bipolar axes. I'm not necessarily an advocate who then says, yes, of course it must be full freedom for everyone and ultimate and so on. No, stop. Yes, so every positive value also has its limits. Yes, a principle of liberalism also says that freedom ends where the freedom of, well, for me, my freedom ends where the freedom of the other person begins. And so we must be able to our freedom to organize. Yes. So that we can do as much as possible for ourselves, but on the other hand, not to cause others or everyone in society, any harm. And so we also need certain regulations that we have in place there. Yes. So, freedom to the greatest extent possible that is justifiable, break time equals 0.5s / because we don't live alone and we can't just do whatever we want, but we also need a certain amount of rules and limitations or restrictions. But I think with this first bipolar axis of values, it's quite clear that between freedom and oppression, we need the freedom side, that we have it, and that we, and I say this somewhat as a warning, are perhaps not aware enough of what a precious asset it is. And that I like to compare it to riding a bike, actually something that you also have to work at constantly. Sure, I can ride a bike downhill sometimes, and then it just rolls. It's good, yeah, fine. But eventually the downhill ride ends, it goes uphill again or levels out, and then I have to pedal, then I have to move, use my legs, and put in the effort so that freedom is maintained. And I think we should really take that to heart in domestic policy. It's nice that many protests against the right are happening now. But I think the civic courage to stand up for freedom and for what we have here as a democratic community is something we should do more often and not just simply consume. So we are also producers of freedom and not just consumers. And that actually leads me straight to the second bipolar pair of values here, which is justice on the one hand and arbitrariness on the other. Yes, and justice is, well, for us, if we stay with domestic policy, which is part one of what I'm doing here, it's the rule of law. Yes, that I can defend myself, that I have my rights against administrative acts, general rulings, but of course also if someone attacks me, that someone takes my side here, that the state, with its prosecutors and its judges, also ensures that the laws are enforced. And what is the consequence of that for the economy? Reliability, of course, so that I can say, hey, if I plan an investment, if I set up a strategy and so on, then I know that in this country it's also predictable. And that there are laws here where I can also assume they won't be abolished tomorrow, but that things will continue. I once heard from a good friend about how things sometimes went in China, how copies of products were being manufactured there. And it actually went so far that these copies then, so to speak, didn't meet their quality standards. And then the original manufacturers from the West actually had to step in somehow, so that, no extreme damage would occur in China regarding the copies and the use of these copies as well. So, it was an extreme example involving ski lifts, where I really thought to myself, that's just unbelievable. So we also don't know how much we should actually appreciate that justice and the rule of law work here. Now, I have to be completely honest, of course, it's not all gold that glitters. I've also just had my first lawsuit because I couldn't reach an agreement with someone. And I'm realizing in hindsight that it wasn't very smart. It would have been better if we talked beforehand. But we still need this justice, and in the form of our rule of law, when I think about the economy and politics, but also society. So that's my second bipolar axis of values. And the third one is now very much in the emotional realm. It has love on one side and hate on the other. Those are the opposites. We all know what it's like to feel real anger and resentment towards something, and maybe even feel hate. But it's also human, or it's scientifically proven, that hate doesn't fulfill you in the long run, but actually creates more and more thirst, so to speak, while love is truly fulfilling. Hartman once expressed it very beautifully. Look at a mother who has a child. She loves the child more than anything. That means there's an intrinsic infinity there, so to speak. And then the mother has a second child. And she loved the second one just as much, also infinitely. And you think, wait a minute, the infinity for the first child, well, how can it be doubled? Well, that's the characteristic, as Hartman nicely puts it, the infinite or transfinite mathematics. You can also read about it from George Cantor, that these infinities are treated differently than finitudes. And the second and the third, and so on, she loves them just the same. And I believe we have in our society and also in the economy, also in politics, a lack of love. That's how I put it. So we actually have a gap. We have a lack of love in the economy. For me, that means being able to truly burn for what you do. Yes, to be fulfilled by what you do. To be fulfilled by what you do. And then the reward in terms of salary and so on comes back. And we often think very rationally, first about the profits, and maybe the salary, before we actually think about what brings benefit to people, what's emotional, what can also be loved. And in politics too, we're increasingly seeing people where I wonder, well, I don't want to say everything was better before, but today it's a huge media circus. And that naturally attracts people who have narcissistic and these media-driven traits, wanting to be talked about everywhere. And whether the point behind it is still really to organize benefits for people, Politics, no matter at what level, whether it's in the state, in society, in the family, every human organization needs politics. So, interpersonal balance, generating majorities in order to be able to move forward accordingly. I often dare to doubt that there's love behind it. And in society, I would say again, that's where there's still the most when it comes to love and not hate. If we look at how many people are in nursing professions, in social professions, and I have a lot of contact, I recently had an interview with Bertram Casper that will be released soon in an episode, How People to Social Work actually dedicate themselves to, well, ultimately bring more love into society. And we are emotional beings and love/hate works on all levels. I'd say the deepest intrinsic one is the family. Yeah, that's where we're closest to each other. Then also the company or social environment, and finally the state. And as Kennedy so beautifully said, first consider what you can do for your country before you consider what your country can do for you. Yeah, can. And that's why a healthy patriotism, not nationalism, patriotism to say, yes, I love my country, you can do that, yeah. But not, I'm German and therefore better than the French or whatever, yeah. There's a very, very big difference. And oh, time is flying. So, right away, the fourth bipolar axis for me. Cooperation, and on the other side, the lone wolf. So cooperation is the recipe for success for humanity. Again, please read Harari, very, very excellent, but also very modern in Yves Morieux, for example, and others. We are deeply shaped so that we, well, want to be particularly good at something. And to work that out for ourselves accordingly, and then we're in a division of labor in our society, in teams. And that's why cooperation is so extremely important today, because what we do is becoming more complex, and for an individual to ride out and be successful alone, that's increasingly rare, increasingly difficult, and teamwork, collaboration, cooperation. I can't preach this often enough. It's extremely important. Although you have to be careful, of course, some things are actually better done alone, but so many are better in a team. And creating the foundations for cooperation here, so that it can flourish, is not that easy. Yeah, so from a scientific perspective, cooperation is, yeah, a very, yeah, complex, difficult, not so easy to achieve reality, or even, yeah, a fact, but very, very quick to destroy. And so that's the point, to look at companies and their culture again. Are they conducive to cooperation or not? Another point, fifth point on my list, the axis of tolerance versus discrimination. Yeah, and tolerance is also something. It has a bit to do with freedom, of course, to look at, hey, otherness. Yeah, and otherness is a treasure, of humanity. Yeah, it naturally contributes to cooperation too, like I just said. Hey, then people are different, then they can do different things, they have different backgrounds. It is ultimately enriching. And if I find this otherness bad, and we see that in populism in politics, but we often see it in business too, they're not doing it right or they're doing it differently, it's stupid and so on. Or even in society, no, then we're quickly in the realm of religion, in the realm of customs and so on. And Hartmann already said exactly that. So the lack of tolerance, the non-recognition of otherness, is actually the virus, the seed at the end of war. Yeah, so I say here, diversity is king. That doesn't mean that we should be arbitrarily multicultural, so to speak. No, that's not the point. In the company, in business, we have to create a, let's say, original corporate culture. But it is fueled by much of what comes in. And that's why tolerance is so important. And it is in politics as well. Of course, politics would have to provide answers and can't just let the whole world into Europe and Germany. That doesn't work. Yeah, but basically, let's look at America. Waves of immigration have strengthened this country throughout history. But I mean, you just have to see what is enough or what is too much. And that's how we have to think in society as well. But tolerance, it must maintain the upper hand over discrimination. That is also a recipe for success for humanity. Sixth scale, time is racing. Creativity versus lack of imagination. Yeah, so here, if we were just realistic optimizers as a human horde, then we'd still be running around in the trees. We need these, also lateral thinking changemakers who really come up with something completely new, think out of the box, and see how we can do it differently. That has brought us a long way. In a positive sense, look at modern medicine, look at many technological advancements. On the other hand, I also say, humans, and as Hartmann says, can make the Sahara bloom, so to speak, but also blow up the planet. So, of course, we always have dangers within this creativity, but we just have to deal with that normally. The seventh axis, bipolar, is solidarity versus selfishness. We are. We grew up as a horde in evolution. Back then it was a death sentence to be excluded from the community, to be kicked out into the wilderness. And that's why, even today, in social groups, in the family, as well as in the economy, in the company, in politics, in society, solidarity is very important to consider. What can I give? 2. How can I help others? I'm actually doing pretty darn well. And how can I push back selfishness a bit? Of course, you need a certain healthy selfishness. And when I think about how I, as an entrepreneur, am fleeced by the state, with taxes and all sorts of bureaucratic nonsense, then you can really get angry. And say, okay, I'm looking out for myself first. And the state takes so much in taxes, it should make sure that others are doing well too. But where do we end up in the end? In the redistribution state, which is unfortunately already very, very much in that direction. And today, the state is also entering into wage competition by paying a citizen's benefit where, if you look closely, you have to ask, is it even worth doing anything and working anymore? So solidarity is very, very important, but it should be done, humanely and with common sense, so that social integration is appropriate. Eighth axis, responsibility, personal contribution to the economy, politics, and society. Or just being a free rider. That's the other end of the axis. And here, lately, as I feel it, we've had a bit more of this point in society. The state has to take care of it. And no longer this, I take responsibility, I go out, I make my contribution. Pioneer media, Gabor Steingart once put it quite nicely, the state used to be the referee, standing outside on the line, refereeing the soccer game, so to speak. I'm of the opinion that he's not just the referee, but also the rule developer, to put it that way. And, lately he's been developing more and more new rules. That's the bureaucracy for all sorts of fields, so that at the end of the day, the soccer players don't even know exactly what rules there are anymore. And how can you even, charge ahead and start running? And maybe be out there feeling a little bit disoriented. But Gabor Steingart also says, now the state no longer wants to just be the referee, it wants to be on the field, it wants to attack, it wants to score goals. And I don't know if that's so smart, if it's actually that good at it. An example from the pandemic, CureVac, 300 million euros completely wasted in investment. BioNTech then did it entirely without any government money. So, to consider here what responsibility I can take on, what contribution I can make, and not just be a free rider, but that the state itself also reflects on what responsibility it has and what contribution it can and cannot make. And the second to last point on my 10-point scale, bipolar between positive and negative, is precisely the ninth bipolar axis, actually the one between positivity and negativity. So, we all know it, glass half full, glass half empty, and we have to see it as half full. And blah 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 and so on. Or Churchill, who says very, very nicely, the optimist sees an opportunity in every difficulty. And the pessimist sees a difficulty in every opportunity. And you can look at it all that way. But folks, you shouldn't practice positivity naively, right? Jim Collins explained this very well in his book, Good to Great, the so-called Stockdale paradox. Stockdale was a highly decorated American general in the Vietnam War who was in a prisoner of war camp in Hanoi. And for 8 years he sort of kept the flag flying so that as few people as possible would break. From actual torture and everything else that also happened there. And he basically said, well, the optimists. I'll call them the naive optimists. They were the ones who broke. They thought, yeah, okay, we'll be out by Christmas, and then Christmas passed. Or now we'll be out by Easter, and then it doesn't happen, right? So you have to face the brutal realities, but you must never lose faith at the end of the day that things will turn out well. Actually lose it. But not through rose-colored glasses, yeah, and that's a good lesson for me. So I recommend taking the Stockdale story to heart. And finally, the 10th bipolar. Axis, yeah, it's fundamental, peace and war, that's what I call it, quite simply. And that's me. I'm here in part 1 and we'll go into part 2 later, the international part. But here it's also about peace within the company, within politics, within society, in the state. How do I create peace in a company? Well, I actually create it by, to have that tolerance I mentioned before, the freedom of expression, the creativity, but also the solidarity. As well. There has to be friction, there has to be a struggle for the best solution within the company. But then, so to speak, to the outside world, you have to, stand together. There shouldn't be any room for disagreement between people. You have to be singing from the same songbook. And it's exactly the same in my opinion in families, but also in politics. And it really annoys me quite often, I have to say clearly, how all these nitty-gritty squabbles are somehow aired in the media. And then, of course, they actually restrict the politicians' own room for maneuver to reach a peaceful solution. And if we take a look at the political landscape now, to view it in terms of internal warfare, well, obviously the AfD. We don't really need to talk much about that. But then also Sarah Wagenknecht coming along, the Wertunian, the left party which is fragmented, the FDP also basically just acting as a fringe party at the moment. We already have a very fragmented landscape, which I don't necessarily see as a negative thing. Countries like the Benelux or Scandinavian ones are used to forming alliances with many different political movements and forces. But it is something that also shows that, in society, clear and straightforward directions are no longer so easy to communicate. Break time equals 0.5s/. And that we perhaps pay too little attention here to peaceful coexistence, to good discourse. And in that context, I think there's a certain erosion caused by populism to be observed. Through, instant social media storms, people are immediately